All right, guys, we are on our third story for the week, our last story that we're going to read this week. This one is actually a autobiography. It's called Keeping Freedom in the Family, Coming of Age in the Civil Rights Movement by Nora Davis Day. So because it's an autobiography, Nora Davis Day is writing this about her own experiences and her own life. Before reading, there's some vocabulary that we talked about yesterday. Just to remind you, a boycott is when we refuse to go to a business because we feel like they're being unfair, or we refuse to use something because it's because of injustice that we see. It's a way of protest. Protest is another word. So when you protest, you're showing that you're expressing disapproval of something. Protest could be a boycott. It can be a sit-in, like we learned about yesterday. It could be a picket line where you hold signs up. All of those are ways to protest. Injustice we know is unfairness when something's not right. And then registering to vote means you're officially recorded as someone who's able to vote. So just kind of a rundown on the civil rights movement. Wesley Law, yesterday we read about, he was a participant in the civil rights movement. That is the movement for people to end segregation and to create a more equal and just society in America. How would you feel if you were forbidden to go to a restaurant or store, or if you weren't allowed to go to the same school as your best friend? Sadly, for a long time in American schools and public places were segregated. This meant that white and black people had to go to separate places. Many people disagreed with segregation and they protested to get laws changed. This was the civil rights movement, and it lasted from 1954 to 1968. When you think of the civil rights movement in America, names like Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks probably come to mind. They were leaders whose names now symbolize what we know of this movement. Martin and Rosa, of course, had help with their efforts, people like Wesley, right? Thanks to the many people who battled segregation, the Civil Rights Act of 1968 was signed by President Lyndon B. Johnson. This act or law made discrimination illegal. Discrimination is the unfair treatment of someone due to their race, gender, or religion. So again, today, this is a very short one, so don't be worried. Yesterday I know was kind of long, but this one's only 2 pages, so only 4 questions. So this is an autobiography. So we want to think about whose point of view this text is written through. And we're going to use the photographs and text to explain what a picket line is. Let's zoom in a little bit, help me out. There's a lot of photographs with captions. The Davis family at a rally for peace in New York City. From left to right, Mom, Dad, Laverne, me, and Guy. Guy made our picket signs. So this photograph is showing me picket signs. No war, it's kind of hard. What do you think these signs say? Can't really see. But it's the whole family. It's just the adults. The kids are out there with their signs too. Let's go up here and read. What do we want? Justice. When do we want it? Now. As I held onto my father's hand, we joined the line of people chanting and walking back and forth in a picket line in front of Lawrence Hospital. The year was 1965, and the hospital workers needed more money and better working conditions. So there we were on a cold Saturday afternoon to protest. When I looked up, I saw a soldier on the roof of the hospital. I squeezed Daddy's hand a little tighter. The soldiers were there to protect us, he said. We were American citizens, and we had the right to gather and to protest. I raised my picket sign as high as I could. I wasn't afraid. I had Daddy and the American Constitution to protect me. I couldn't wait to get back home to tell my brother and sister, Guy and Laverne, about my day on the picket line. Dinner time was always special at our house. We would sit around the table, filling our mouths with food and our minds with ideas. Mom and Dad encouraged us to talk about anything we wanted to, anything. Sometimes we talked about our family, about Dad's childhood in segregated Waycross, Georgia, and Mom's love for Harlem, the part of New York City where she grew up. Other times we talked about big ideas like democracy, freedom, justice, and civil rights. Here's a picture over here. Um, I was in the 4th grade when I met Judge, hold on, I'm having a, um, J. Watt, Waddy's Waring. His court decisions paved the way for school desegregation and voter registration in the South. So going back to the questions that we were asked on these 2 pages. Through whose point of view is this text written? So I would, for this answer, we could say that this is a biography or an autobiography. So it's written through the point of view of a person that grew up during the civil rights movement named Nora Davis Day. The photographs in the text help me explain what a picket line is. Okay, so the photographs help me know what a picket line is because I can see them with signs and kind of a group of people. There's lots, seems to be a crowd behind them. And then looking at the text itself to just figure out what a picket line is, it says people chanting and walking back and forth in a picket line in front of Lawrence Hospital. So it's where people have signs and they just kind of walk back and forth with their signs and chanting slogans, maybe like the slogan up top here, we want justice, when do we want it now? It's a form of protest, right? People were protesting, they wanted hospital workers to make more money and have better working conditions. So we're going to read the last 2 pages, and when we do, we're going to think about how does Nora's family decide to boycott during Christmas, and how does the author help the reader understand that protesting and fighting injustice is important to her family. Some days Mom and Dad weren't home for dinner. They were actors, Ozzie Davis and Ruby Dee, but because they were Black, they didn't have the same opportunities and rights as other citizens. They decided to use their lives as actors to make a difference. They wanted to make America a place where injustice was not welcome and where Guy, Laverne, and I would always feel like we belonged. And so it was that my ordinary life of chores and homework and hopscotch soon became extraordinary. Every day there were new ideas to talk about at dinner. We learned new words like nonviolence, sit in, and boycott. Whenever they could, Mom and Dad took us with them to programs, protests, and picket lines. 2 years earlier, I knew I was going to do that. Sorry, guys. 2 years earlier, in 1963, we had moved into our new house and gotten our first television set, just in time for one of the most important years in American history. We weren't allowed to watch TV during the school week unless something really important was going on, like the March on Washington, when Martin Luther King Jr. gave his famous I Have a Dream speech. I wished I could be there with Mom and Dad. I asked myself what kids like me could do to make a difference. Later that year, I had an answer to my question. So her parents went and watched that speech, but she had to stay home. When 4 Black girls were killed in a church bombing in Alabama, we realized that the fight for change would be hard, long, and dangerous. Mom and Dad encouraged us to think about how we would protest the bombing. Some people said we should boycott Christmas. This was our first Christmas in the new house, and the spirit of giving was important to us. Here's a picture. It says, Daddy at the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in 1963. He and Mom were MCs. So they were some of the people that went up and talked and introduced the other speakers. So going back to what they're talking about, the church bombing. So during that time, a lot of people resisted, we know, and they resisted in violent ways, like even though a lot of the protesters were being nonviolent. So there was a church in Alabama, and it was a Black church, and it was bombed. And when it was bombed, there were 4 little girls inside that were killed. That was a pretty big moment in the civil rights movement. And in response to that, her family decided to boycott Christmas. So what does that mean if you boycott Christmas? Like, I know you can boycott a business, but how do you boycott a holiday, right? So instead of boycotting Christmas, our family decided to boycott Christmas shopping. So they're going to still celebrate Christmas, but they're not going to go shopping and spend money on gifts for each other. Instead of buying gifts, our family gave them money to civil rights groups. Guy, Laverne, and I each gave each other gifts we made with our own hands. And when the time came to hang the homemade paper holiday chain, I wrote the names of the girls in the last 4 loops. In our own small way, we learned the true meaning of giving. So instead of using their money to buy each other presents, they donated it to people that were fighting for civil rights. When we gathered for dinner that night, we said a special prayer for the girls and for our country. And I knew that Christmas at the Davis home would never be the same. So maybe that's a tradition they continued, right? And this picture up here, my sister, my brother, and me at the White House in 1995. Mom and Dad got the National Medal of Art. So their family sounds pretty successful, right? Down at the bottom, we have a graphic feature of a timeline. Looks like some important events maybe from her life. Let's see. It says 1950, Nora Davis is born in New York City. 1959, Nora and Guy meet Judge J. Waddies Waring, a champion of civil rights. Remember that picture from the previous page. In 1962, the family marches for peace in New York City. In 1963, that's when the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama is bombed and the girls are killed. In 1965, hospital workers picket in Bronxville, New York for 55 days. So that looks like what was in the beginning of the story. In 1972, Nora votes in her first presidential election. So that's not included in this story, but it kind of takes us further, like what happens next. In 1985, Nora boycotts U.S. companies doing business in segregated South Africa. So I don't know if you remember from our class meeting, learning about Nelson Mandela and how South Africa remained segregated until the 1990s. So even though there was no segregation in America, it was happening in other countries, and she was still fighting against segregation around the world by boycotting businesses that worked with South Africa. In 2001, Nora speaks to students at her local high school about social justice. So let's go to the questions and see what we can think about. So reread page 239. How does Nora's family decide to boycott during Christmas? I think we've talked about that already, how they decide not to go Christmas shopping. They donate their money to civil rights organizations, and they make each other gifts. Number 2, how does the author help the reader understand that protesting and fighting injustice are important to our family? I think that there's a lot of different ways the author does this. Boycotting Christmas, for example, is kind of a big deal. I'm kind of thinking about over here, when they first got their television set, it says they weren't allowed to watch TV during the school week unless something really important was going on, like Martin Luther King Jr. giving his I Have a Dream speech. So they kind of have this rule, no TV during the school week, except when something pretty awesome is happening. And they also, she talks a lot about at the dinner table, they talk with their children about words like nonviolent, sit-in, and boycott. And that was part of, and they even brought their children to these picket lines when they could. So I think all of those are different ways that she's showing us that her family thought protesting and fighting injustice was important. So that is the last one for this week. What you guys are going to do is you're going to open your copy of this slideshow and you're going to answer these 4 questions down here in the speaker notes. So you just type in number 1, answer number 1, hit enter, number 2, answer number 2. Make sure you use complete sentences, please, 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 and use text evidence. Like, do your best, always, right? Okay. I hope you guys enjoyed this story as well.